This Can't Be Happening at MacDonald Hall by Korman, Round Two. The window of room 201 opened silently and a shadowy figure climbed out and dropped to the ground. Bruno crept along the edge of the deserted campus, across the dark highway and over the wrought iron fence that surrounded Miss Scrimmage's finishing school for young ladies. Beside the residence building, he picked up a handful of pebbles and tossed them at a second-floor window. After a few moments, a window opened and a familiar head appeared. "Bruno? Is that you?" a voice whispered. "Who else?" said Bruno. "Listen, I have to borrow Petunia for a couple of days." "What for?" "I have to get rid of a friend," Bruno replied. "Can you get her down for me?" "Give me a couple of minutes." Bruno waited. Finally, a cage appeared in the window and began to dangle slowly toward the ground, suspended by an Indian belt. 3 pairs of pantyhose, 1 bathrobe belt, and the bathrobe itself. "Got it," whispered Bruno. "Thanks, Diane." "Just don't mention it. Just don't forget to feed her." "What does she eat?" Bruno asked. "This," the girl replied. A bag of My Choice skunk chow sailed out the window and clunked Bruno on the head. "Women," he thought in disgust. With the caged skunk under one arm and the skunk food in the other, he made his way to MacDonald Hall and into his room. After hiding Petunia under his bed, he changed Elmer's alarm clock to his own customary rising hour, 8:45, and fell asleep. Although it was well after midnight, a dim light still shone in the print shop. Boots and the editor of the school newspaper were laboring over the press. A single sheet of newsprint lay before them. "I'll tear it out," Boots said, "so it'll look like it's from a real newspaper. Is there really such a disease as creeping calliitis? Or creeping caliotis?" the editor asked. "I hope not," grinned Boots. "Awful, isn't it?" "Sure is. What are you going to do with the clipping?" "It's for a hypochondriac friend of mine," Boots explained. "By the time I get through with him, he'll be a basket case. Thanks a lot for your help." "Any time. I pity your friend, though." "I don't," Boots replied grimly. "It's 9:15, screamed Elmer, bounding out of bed and hitting his head on the wall. "Who changed my alarm clock?" "I did," said Bruno, dressing rapidly. "It's about time you learned to get up at a civilized hour." "But what about breakfast? I'll starve. What about classes? They've never been late in my life. What will they do to me?" "If you're 5 minutes late, you get a detention," Bruno explained gravely. "If you're 10 minutes late, it's the rack." At 8:55, Elmer flew out of the room with his shirt tails flapping, his belt dangling and his shoelaces untied. He was unwashed and uncombed, but he had 5 minutes to spare. As soon as Elmer had gone, Bruno reached under his bed, pulled out the cage, and opened the door. "Good morning, Petunia. I trust you slept well. How about some breakfast?" Ignoring the food, Petunia stepped daintily across the room, examining her surroundings. "So okay, no breakfast. I've got to go to class now anyway," said Bruno. "Be a good girl, Petunia, and when Elmer comes in, scare the living daylights out of him." At first light, Boots began to put his plan into action. He checked the phony newspaper article before putting it into his desk drawer. Large red spots. Boots took a small paper bag from under his pillow. It contained a brush and a jar of poster paint. With great care, he began to dab red spots on the face of his sleeping roommate. He examined his handiwork, silently congratulated himself, and went back to bed. When he opened his eyes at 8, George was just waking up. "George, what's wrong with you?" Boots cried. George turned pale. What do you mean?" he stammered. "There are big red spots all over your face. See for yourself." Boots motioned toward the mirror. George looked at his reflection and shrieked. "Oh, what is it? What is it?" Boots gasped. "Oh my gosh, I think I know." He opened his drawer, dug around the contents, and finally drew out the newspaper article. It was in Thursday's Star. My mother sent it to me. Listen." He began to read. "Creeping caliotis. A rare tropical disease has killed 9 people in Toronto within the last 36 hours. The disease is believed to have come to Canada through imported livestock and is highly contagious. Major symptoms are large red spots scattered over the facial area, followed by shortness of breath, then head, throat, and chest pains." Right on cue, George began to puff. "I'm having shortness of breath," he gasped. "I ache all over. I've got creeping caliotis. Get me to the infirmary right away." "No, don't move," Boots cried. "Listen." He continued to read. Chances of survival are drastically reduced if the victim attempts to move around. Complete bed rest is essential. Boots handed the clipping to George. Read it for yourself, he said. You'd better get back to bed right away. George nodded and crept into his bed. The possibility that his life, though barely started, might soon be over stunned him. I'll get Dr. Leroy right away, Boots assured him. But first, no offense, I think. He wheeled out George's quarantine screen and placed it between the two beds, making sure the sign was on George's side. Creeping coyotes, George moaned. Tell the doctor to hurry. I will, Boots promised. But don't you move from that bed. You need complete bed rest, or you've had it. Boots picked up his books and headed for class, leaving George at death's door. At 4 that afternoon, Bruno hurried to his room with a jar containing the last of the 550 ants he owed Elmer. As he was about to open the door, a loud scream erupted from within, followed by an enormous crash. The door flew open and out shot Elmer, his expression wild, his nose bleeding. He ran full tilt into Bruno, knocking him down and sending the jar of ants spiraling into the wall, where it shattered. Once again, Dormitory 2 was crawling with insects. My ants! Bruno shrieked in perfect imitation of Elmer. Skunk! Cried Elmer. What's a skunk doing in our room? Bruno had been waiting all day for that question. I'm a skunkologist, he explained. My world is the skunk world. Elmer just stared at him. Then Petunia trotted out into the hall, and Elmer screamed again. Stop that, warned Bruno. If you upset her, she'll spray the whole place. Elmer crouched behind Bruno and continued to scream as the skunk explored the hall. Shut up! Called the voice. I'm trying to do my homework. A door opened and a boy peered out into the hall. Oh no! Ants! He cried. They're back, and this time they've brought a skunk with them. More doors opened. Soon dozens of boys were milling around. Ants! Skunk! Help! Bruno, worried that Petunia was going to be trampled in the riot, picked her up and carried her over to Elmer. Here, Petunia, he said. Kiss and make up. You weren't nice. You gave Uncle Elmer a nasty fright. Elmer backed away, trembling. Stand still, Bruno ordered. You'll step on my ants. You keep ants too? Cried one boy. 201's a bug house. I had 96 ants in that jar, Bruno sternly informed Elmer. You owe me 96 ants. Only then did Bruno notice a familiar figure standing at the end of the hall, his arms folded, watching. Mr. Sturgeon spoke quietly, but every boy heard and obeyed. All of you, into your rooms. Walton, give me that skunk. Bruno held Petunia out to Mr. Sturgeon. She bit his finger. I'll get her cage, sir, Bruno said quickly. He went into his room, fished the cage out from under the bed, and locked Petunia in. Here she is, sir. You carry it, ordered Mr. Sturgeon, and follow me. Unless I'm mistaken, this animal is a pet of a young lady at Miss Scrimmage's. I am not going to ask how it came into your possession, because frankly I do not wish to know, but we will return it to its owner together. Boots tiptoed into his room after classes. The light was dim, and the victim lay in his bed, looking paler than the sheets and apparently breathing his last. Where have you been? George moaned. Where's the doctor? Brace yourself, Boots told him, laying a handkerchief around his face like a surgical mask. Dr. Leroy has creeping caliotis, too. So does 3/4 of the school. They're dropping like flies. It's a full-fledged epidemic. Has anybody died? George asked, terrified. Not yet, Boots replied gravely, but there are lots in comas. The Army has sent a medical unit and the campus is in quarantine. There's even a roadblock. But did you tell them about me? George groaned. Boots nodded. Of course. But you're 352nd on the waiting list. Don't worry. I'll stay and take care of you until help comes. George was overcome with gratitude. He reached for a paper and pencil on the night table. I've been writing my will, he croaked, his throat obviously very sore. I'm going to leave you my magnico for your devotion, Melvin. He wrote a few lines and collapsed back onto the pillow. Could you get me a cold cloth for my head? He pleaded. I must have a terribly high fever. Boots wet a washcloth and gently placed it on his roommate's forehead. I'd better go and write my mother, he said sadly. If I catch creeping caliotis from you, I want her to have a last few words to remember me by. Oh, groaned George. He raised a trembling hand to his forehead and picked up the wet cloth to rearrange it. Large red blobs covered the white terry cloth. He stared at it for a few seconds, then rubbed it across his cheek. More red blobs. Paint, said George softly. Then louder, Paint! You tricked me! I'll kill you! He leapt out of bed, grabbed a cricket bat, and tore after Boots, who by this time was out of the room and halfway out of the building. Mr. Sturgeon, Bruno, and Petunia were making their way across the campus when Boots flashed by. Hello, sir, he panted. Seconds later, a pajama-clad George Wexford Smythe III thundered by in hot pursuit, screaming and waving a cricket bat. Bruno did not dare comment, but as they continued on their way, he distinctly heard Mr. Sturgeon murmur, I hope he catches him. And that is the end of that chapter.